conversation or presentation from the Honorable Lizzie Fletcher, the Congresswoman from the U.S. House of Representatives of Texas District 7 in Houston. She'll be talking about congressional priorities for energy policy. So be on the lookout for emails from the Energy Institute about that talk. It will be live streamed as this one is, and also be on YouTube as well, and there'll be a recording of it afterwards. Just giving it one more minute as folks are coming in. We're really delighted to have Dr. Kaufman join us today, not least of which because he's a UT alum and took a course from me many moons ago, so long ago, at least in my career here, that I cannot quite recall this specific year. So, but we're delighted to have him here, and he has gone on to do terrific and illustrious things. So let me quickly, briefly introduce him. He's a research scholar at the SIPA Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Dr. Kaufman, I'm just going to show the bio because it helps me be able to draw attention to all the things that he's done. He served in the Obama administration as the Deputy Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, received his BS in economics from Duke University and his PhD and MS in economics here from the University of Texas at Austin. So I'm going to turn it over to him because we have a terrific talk ahead of us about climate policy in the Biden administration with President-elect Biden. So Dr. Kaufman, thanks so much for coming.
Great. Well, thanks for that intro. It's really an honor to be invited. Great to be back. I was just saying to Josh that I only wish I could be back in person, but hopefully another year. So hopefully you can see the screen that I just shared here. Want to thank everybody for joining. I hope everybody's doing okay. It always feels a little bit strange when there's a public health crisis going on to be talking about something else without really acknowledging that. But just wanted to sort of say that up front and then get into the topic of the day, which is climate and decarbonization and the new administration. So my plan for this talk was to start off on a fairly basic high level. I'm never sure exactly who is in the audience for a talk like this. So I want to start there, but go relatively quickly through those parts so we can sort of get into the meat of the trends we're seeing in the energy and climate space today and what we might expect from a new administration. And then most importantly, I'll stop talking well before the end of the hour so we can hopefully have a good discussion, which is usually the best part. So if that sounds good, I will kick it off. And we will start with the climate challenge. So always dangerous to have an economist talk about climate, but I think it's good to say a few words about why we're talking about this issue at all. And I always find a chart like this to be most striking because once you accept that humans are responsible for releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the very basic science that carbon dioxide is a heat trapping gas, something like this, which shows the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last million or so years, it becomes very clear why things are getting weird out there, right? We are sort of well outside the range of recent precedent, and every year that we keep emitting, we'll go higher and higher off this chart into very unprecedented territory for mankind. The other critical thing to understand is what I'm showing in this chart, and that's the relationship between concentrations of greenhouse gases and emissions. So you have concentrations on the bottom graph here and emissions on the top. And if you look at, for example, that dotted blue line, what that shows you is that even when we stabilize emissions. So even when annual emissions are flat, concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere continue to rise. So you may have heard of the analogy to filling up the bathtub. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a really long time. So we're just filling it up with carbon dioxide. In order to stabilize CO2 in the atmosphere, we have to reduce emissions close to zero. So that's what you see with the dotted green line here. And that's why you hear all this talk about the need to get to zero or net zero emissions. And I should say, if there are any clarifying questions or anything like that, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. And I think Josh was going to let us know if there was anything pressing before we get to the discussion later on. So we need to get to net zero emissions. That is not where the world is currently heading. What this shows you is global, in this case, carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels broken out by key regions of the world. You can make an argument, and I probably would, that global emissions are starting to flatten on an annual basis after rising we're showing the last 60 years here. But again, flattening is not the same as decreasing rapidly towards zero. And if you look at the data from the recent IPCC reports that show when global emissions have to get to near zero levels to stabilize temperatures, we're talking about mid-century-ish, 2050-ish, for a chance at 1.5 degrees of warming, and a couple decades later to preserve a chance for 2 degrees warming. And that's what scientists say will sort of avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. So that's the task in front of us. Again, this is global emissions. Pretty much everyone who looks at this sort of understands that the United States, if this is going to happen, the United States is going to have to be a leader, both because of our capability to do so and also our historical responsibility for a lot of the emissions that are up there. So we're going to talk about the United States for the rest of this talk. We're also going to focus on the energy system, and that's for two reasons. Number one, if you look here at this pie chart, this is just where US greenhouse gas emissions come from. A lot of it, most of it is coming from energy uses. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that it's the only thing I'm even remotely qualified to talk about. So you'll have to take your forest management questions and save those for a different webinar. But yeah, so here you see electricity usage, transportation, energy use in buildings and industry. That's 3/4 or more of the pie. Okay, so before we get into the messy sort of reality of politics, I think it's helpful to spend a few minutes on sort of a more normative framework, right? So what do we want to happen from a technological standpoint and then from a policy standpoint? Because I think these questions, unlike the politics, are actually somewhat straightforward. So first of all, on the technology front, what I'm showing here is a sort of summary chart from a report I worked on a few years ago called the United States Mid-Century Strategy for Deep Decarbonization. So the goal here was to show various different pathways that the United States could get to, at the time, 80% reductions in emissions by 2050. So it's somewhat outdated at this point, but really I wanted to show it mainly for the activities, which would not change. So you can see here, it's showing you emissions on the left from starting in 2005, which is the typical baseline year that the United States uses. Emissions, if you sort of follow the chart to the right, emissions want to go upward as the economy grows. And that's where you get up to almost 10 gigatons potentially by 2050. And then you see all the different actions that we would have to undertake to get down to those 80% reduction levels. So let's focus on the green area, which is transforming the energy system. And we broke that out into 3 categories. So first, energy efficiency. So we want to take all of the energy uses across the different sectors of the economy, and through different technologies and strategies, provide them more efficiently. So think of better fuel economy for your vehicles, for example. The second major category here is decarbonizing electricity. So most of our electricity today is still produced with either coal or natural gas. We need it to come from renewables or from nuclear energy, or even some still from fossil fuels, but as long as we effectively capture it and store it underground, it has the potential to be emissions free. And then we have the third category, which isn't the largest, but might actually be the hardest, which we call fuel switching. So that's taking, we're driving internal combustion vehicles or furnaces in our home or in industry, and either electrifying them, and the electricity is now clean, or producing some sort of low carbon fuel, like hydrogen or biomass, something along those lines. So those are the 3 main actions. If we're talking about net zero as opposed to 80% by 2050, the actions wouldn't change. We would just have to do more of it quicker. It also sort of raises the stakes on, to the right here, you see another bar for carbon dioxide removal technologies. And I think that becomes quite a bit more important with a net zero framing too, just because you don't have this sort of residual 20% of emissions to work with. And it might actually be cheaper and easier to scrub the atmosphere of carbon dioxide than to get rid of some of those emission sources on this time frame. So that's the technology side of things. Moving to policy, which is where I spend most of my time. I'm going to sort of present this in 2 steps. If you're developing a climate policy, you want to start with a carbon price, a price on carbon, which I say of some form here. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, you really want to align all the incentives of the economy with your climate goals. And a carbon price is sort of a broad organizing policy that can help you do that. The second major reason is that we want the transition to be as cheap as possible, right? And that's not going to happen if we don't have some form of carbon price in place. And this slide is a fairly basic way of trying to show you why that is. If you take just hypothetically, you imagine all the different ways we can reduce emissions across the economy. And in this case, we've sorted them from cheapest on the left to most expensive, the higher bars on the right. And you establish any carbon price. So in this case, it shows $30 a ton carbon price in yellow. What that does is encourage anyone who can reduce emissions for less than that amount to do so. And if it costs more than that amount, you're going to pay the carbon price, which turns into revenue for the government, which is important because you can use that revenue to counteract any adverse effects of the policy. And hypothetically, we showed $30 a ton here. If you want to reduce emissions more, you raise the carbon price higher. So that's where you start. A carbon price itself is absolutely not a climate strategy alone. And what you want to do is combine the carbon price with what you might call complementary climate policies. A couple of years ago, we proposed a framework or a definition of how policymakers might think of complementary policies. We said a policy is complementary if it enables lower cost emissions reductions or if it achieves a separate policy objective at a lower cost than a carbon price can achieve on its own. And then you start looking at the different types of policies that are out there, and quite a few fall into this category. So across the screen here, if you go all the way to the left, these are sort of the policy categories that in this particular study we deemed most complementary with a carbon price. And that includes regulations of emissions that are just not going to be covered by a carbon price. That would be emissions from the land sector, methane leaks from fossil fuel systems. It's just not feasible to monitor and verify emissions reductions there. It includes regulating local air pollutants. So that's where we get at sort of the separate policy objective. And that's where I think a big part of addressing a lot of the important environmental justice concerns will come in. Eliminating fossil fuel subsidies is sort of a no-brainer in a lot of cases. Energy efficiency policies is kind of important because that's an example of where the barrier isn't really price related usually, right? It's not that efficient light bulbs are necessarily too expensive. There's typically behavioral barriers to improving energy efficiency, and we need other types of policies to address those barriers. Same type of story with the funding of innovation in low carbon technologies. And then the last box there on the left is public infrastructure. So things like building electricity transmission or mass transit, or just smarter cities in general can enable cheaper and faster decarbonization, particularly alongside a carbon price. And then one thing I didn't say on the last slide is that there's a lot of different ways you can think about implementing a carbon price. The most straightforward way might just be a tax, but you could also do it with a cap and trade program where you're capping the amount of emissions every year and creating a market where those sort of permits to emit can be bought and sold. Or there's been a lot of talk recently about clean electricity standards, for example, which I think for political reasons people kind of describe it as this whole separate bucket of policy. But when you actually look at these policies, essentially what they're trying to do is exactly this for the power sector, just without the revenue production. So one last thing, and apologies, this is a bit of shameless self-promotion. We recently published a study that looked at the question of what kind of carbon prices do we want in the context of a broader climate strategy and a net zero emissions pathway. So we described sort of the ways that policymakers might think about estimating those carbon price pathways, and we produced our own illustrative estimates for the United States as well, and that's what I'm showing on the screen here. So this is one model, and take the results of one model with a grain of salt always, but you can see here on the left we show various net zero pathways. So the blue one would be the net zero by 2050 pathway. That's President-elect Biden's goal. And then you move over to the right and you see the carbon prices consistent with that pathway are in the range of $50 a ton by 2025 and about $100 a ton by 2030. So that's my overview of, in a sensible world, what we might see happen. We would see that policymakers who are interested in addressing climate change would put together a package that includes not just a carbon price, but all these other policies I mentioned as well. Unfortunately, we don't live in a sensible world where that has happened. And I think we need to get into the more messy parts that I mentioned earlier, which is what we're seeing in the real world. And it's not so binary, I think, that like, just because Congress has not gotten its act together, there is no good news. And I want to, before we get into the sort of prospects for a Biden administration, let's talk about a few sort of trends that I think are really important for understanding the current landscape for climate policy in the country. First of all, if you look at, so before I showed you a pie chart of where US emissions are coming from, if you look at it in terms of sort of a time series by sector, you can see the green line, that's power sector emissions from electricity. The power sector is decarbonizing over the last decade or more. So that's good news. Not so much good news everywhere else. So the power sector is about 25% of our emissions now. The rest, transportation, industry, buildings, emissions are very flat, which by the way doesn't mean nothing is happening, because emissions want to grow with the economy, and you actually need you need to take action even to have a flat trajectory like this. But we're only seeing sort of an aggressive decarbonization path in the power sector right now. And to go one step deeper than that, it's actually not it's not the power sector as a whole as much as what we're seeing is coal going away. So this slide shows you generation of electricity in the United States by fuel source. And you can see even just 10, 15 years ago, coal was the dominant source of electricity in the country, and it's just fallen off a cliff in the last 10 years or so. And filling in for it has been renewables in purple there. The rise is mostly solar and wind, and natural gas in green. So this is really good news, because coal is the most carbon intensive and sort of overall dirtiest fuel. But what it also shows is that natural gas is still a fossil fuel that produces greenhouse gas emissions, and current trends are certainly not leading to a reduction in gas use, not yet, at least. And this also presents some really important challenges for parts of the country that are reliant on the coal industry. So that's the first trend I wanted to mention. The second trend, which is just sort of purely positive, is what we've seen out of clean energy technologies over the last year. Here, what you see, I stole this slide from my friend Jesse Jenkins at Princeton. I think I still stole a couple of these slides from him. It shows the reduction of costs of solar energy and wind and batteries, and it's been remarkable, and like way beyond what anyone was predicting 10 or 15 years ago, and has helped to drive those trends I showed earlier in the power sector. It has made sort of the possibility of aggressive action much more feasible in many more places than it would have seemed, again, 5 or 10 years ago. So what we need to see is more of this across different types of clean energy technologies, and in particular outside the power sector. The last trend I wanted to mention was countries and to some extent states starting to step up over the last few years and take climate seriously to an extent that we've just never seen before. So this is just one way of looking at it, but countries with net zero emissions targets, this was not even a thing a few years ago. Now you have a good portion of Europe covered with fairly aggressive net zero targets. And then turn your attention to Asia also, where you have Japan, South Korea, and most amazingly, China, who maybe a month or two ago sort of surprised the world by announcing its own net zero by 2060 target, which really sort of is a game changer from what can be accomplished on a global level if indeed they are serious about that. And then to some extent, we've seen the same thing from US states. Right here, again, I'm just showing you states with net zero targets, either through statute or executive order. And we're up to, I don't know, a dozen states who have done so over the last few years. We'd get a whole lot more coverage if I showed you a map of state level actions, in particular on clean energy with things like renewable portfolio standards. I think 25 or 30 states have those in place. So state action is never going to be enough because you have all this white space, and the white space is very correlated with where a lot of the emissions are. But in the absence of federal government action, it's been a really important trend for sort of keeping emissions from continuing to rise during the Trump administration. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about climate in a Biden administration. This was the title of the talk, I think. I saved this for less time at the end because honestly, who the heck knows what's going to happen next year? But why don't we talk about possibilities, at least, for what might happen across different important areas of action. And I think it's worth starting with what President-elect Biden has actually said. He has focused on climate more than I've ever seen from a presidential candidate before. I mean, that was true among all of the candidates on the Democratic side this cycle. He had a different climate plan earlier on in his campaign, but over the summer, when he became the nominee, he replaced it with this sort of, he calls it the Build Back Better plan, which is sort of a combination of what he wants to do on climate and stimulus to help with economic recovery as well. And it really has two parts to it, which you can sort of divide into the carrots and the sticks. In terms of the carrots, that's what you see on top here. Investments is a lot of money. He's calling for $2 trillion over 4 years, spending on clean energy and other low carbon solutions across the economy. Typically, in normal times, economists like me might raise our eyebrows at the idea of sort of focusing climate strategy on spending. But truthfully, it's exactly what the economy needs right now. We're all buying fewer plane tickets. People have lost their jobs. They're spending less in general. We need more spending from the federal government, and we probably will for a while. Might as well use that spending in productive ways, and this is certainly one of them. So that's the carrot side of things. In terms of the sticks, the sort of direct policies to address emissions, his campaign platform was more narrow, really focused on the power sector, saying, let's make electricity carbon pollution free by 2035, kind of implying that it would be done through some form of clean electricity standard. And from a political standpoint, I think that makes a lot of sense, because what I showed you earlier was the power sector sort of trending in that direction anyway. So it does sort of seem like the easier lift, I think, than thinking about transforming these other sectors. Of course, the problem is that the president can't do either of these things himself. So it's worth talking about the reality of what can he do and what will he need others to help him with. So I'm going to break this up into three different parts. First of all, I'm calling this actions that the president can take by quote unquote himself. And there's a lot here. You can roll back quite a bit of what President Trump has done through executive orders. Government and the military buys a lot of stuff, has a lot of facilities. You can take those in a lower carbon direction. You can do a lot to facilitate state actions. That includes California has a special waiver under the Clean Air Act to do things like implement its own vehicle standards that other states can follow California instead of the federal government. Trump was trying to take that away. That won't happen anymore. There are disclosure rules for corporations, which a new Treasury Secretary Yellen, I think will absolutely look into acting on drilling and sort of renewable energy procurement on public lands. And then I think foreign policy is important too, not just through the Paris Agreement, but there's a lot of leverage that the United States has in terms of forging new types of agreements and enhancing action, especially when you look at narrow areas like what the Obama administration did on looking at refrigerants and emissions from them and forging policies that countries could get on board with. You could see those types of narrow actions in combination, especially now that you have a lot of willing actors overseas. So that's one category. I guess one step beyond what the president can do himself is what the agencies of the executive branch are authorized to do. And everything you've heard out of the Biden administration so far has been that this idea of a whole government approach is the phrase they keep using, which means you're really going to see action across all government agencies to the extent they have authority on climate. So this isn't close to an exhaustive list, but certainly look out for EPA authority under the Clean Air Act. This is where President Obama tried to act on climate in his second term. Power plant regulations, methane from oil and gas wells, the refrigerants that I mentioned before, CAFE standards and equivalent GHG emission standards for cars. I would expect the federal government to get working on new, more stringent rules immediately, starting next year. And then we have things that the Department of Energy can do through some fairly old now energy policies like appliance and equipment standards, policies to promote low carbon fuels, which have been terribly ineffective so far, but perhaps could be improved. And then the last thing I put specifically I wanted to shout out was the FERC proceedings, because FERC has a lot of control in regulating electricity markets. And I think a FERC with a majority Biden appointees could go a long way towards facilitating the deployment of solar and wind and batteries that is becoming cost effective across a lot of the country. So that's step two. The problem, I guess I'll say one more thing about agency action. Really, there's two problems. Number one is the durability of it, right? So as I mentioned, this is where President Obama focused in his second term, and most of that is gone now, right? Because it only is going to survive as long as you have a willing executive branch. And the second problem is the judiciary. Right now, we have a very conservative court that's going to not take a very expansive view of what EPA and other agencies can do under their existing authority. So the Obama administration, with its Clean Power Plan, tried to basically put a carbon price in place on the power sector. I'm skeptical a Biden administration would even try to do something like that, just because the courts sort of halted the Obama administration action near the end of his term, and now we have a much more conservative court. So in terms of how can you get around that and get the types of actions that would put us on a more aggressive pathway, you really need Congress. And I split the congressional action part into two slides here. The first one is the relatively easy stuff. And that doesn't mean it's not important. We probably will see continued funding of clean energy innovation. You might get bipartisan support for an increase to that funding as well. The opportunity for stimulus, fiscal stimulus that could come over the next year, that's an opportunity to spend a lot of money. Congress likes spending money on things, and under a Biden administration, I'd imagine a lot of this will be clean. So you could see tax credits, the extensions of existing ones on solar and wind, carbon capture, electric vehicles, those types of things. And then, Congress had been talking about infrastructure for a very long time and not doing much over the last few years. So an infrastructure bill with, this framed towards cleaner transit options and electricity transmission, and those could go a long way towards facilitating emissions reductions. But then there's the hard stuff, and unfortunately, it's critical policy actions here. So here are policies like a carbon price, which we talked about earlier, different types of sectoral standards that you could see, and then like the real sort of game-changing expenditures, propping up a federal climate bank. I'm giving my colleagues who just produced a book called the National Energy Innovation Mission a shout out here. They're saying we need to actually triple funding for clean energy innovation over the next 5 or 6 years. All of these things, might be very justifiable, but will be harder to do in a split Congress. And I'm not going to handicap that. Maybe Josh is the political scientist, so maybe he'll weigh in on that. But I think it's fair to say whatever probability you put on any of these hard things happening, it will be lower if Mitch McConnell retains control over the Senate, which we'll find out in January with the 2 Senate runoff races. So I wanted to end here just with some numerical estimates of where we might be headed. I sort of took this as an opportunity to organize my own thoughts on where emissions in the country might be going over the next 5 or 10 years, which I think is an important exercise to do, but also important not to take too seriously because we are perpetually really bad at forecasting these things. But with that in mind, what I've done here is split it out into 2 different scenarios that I'm calling no climate legislation on the left and with climate legislation on the right. And really, I'm defining climate legislation as the hard stuff that we need Congress for on the last page. So things like an economy-wide carbon price. And just to sort of orient you here, that red line shows where emissions were in 2019. It's about 13% below 2005 levels, which is that typical baseline year. The United States commitment under the Obama administration to the Paris Agreement was to get to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. And one reason to do this exercise is that the Biden administration will have to or will update that in the coming year, and will probably put forward a target for 2030. So what I did was just sort of cobble together trends across different emissions uses and studies of what different types of actions might lead to. And as you can see here on the left, without climate legislation, but that still includes all the other stuff that we talked about that the president and the executive branch and to some extent Congress could do, you're still going to see, I think, significant emissions reductions over the next 5 or 10 years. And I guess this is assuming, this is a big assumption, that we don't see any more Trumps in the White House. We see sort of consistent commitment, at least from the president, to reduce U.S. emissions. And, that could be in sort of the 28 to 38% reduction range by 2030. And then you go to the right side and you see that with climate legislation, you could go quite a bit further than that and get somewhere in the 40 to 50% reduction range by 2030. And that's considering, not wild policies, but the types of policies that you've seen proposed and sort of co-sponsored in Congress over the last couple of years. So a couple of ways to look at this. I mean, I think from a pessimistic perspective, which is sort of my natural habitat, really for sort of consistency with those sort of net zero by 2050 goals that we were talking about earlier, you really need to be on the right side of this screen and to get in the 40 to 50% range by 2030. The EU has, is planning to up its own target for 2030 to 50 or 55%. So I think from an international perspective, that's sort of the least the United States can do. And I'm saying it's pessimistic just because it's just hard to see the legislative pathway there over the next couple of years right now. It's much easier to envision the left side of the screen here. But I guess to end on a more optimistic note, these are still some pretty significant reductions we're seeing on the left side of the screen here. If you had told me 5 years ago that we were going to have 4 years of a Trump administration and no serious climate legislation out of Congress, and we'd still be looking at the potential for 30 to 40% reductions by 2030, I would have thought you were crazy. So I think a lot of this has to do with the trends that I mentioned earlier and sort of the increasing momentum and willingness for policymakers to take this issue seriously. And if that continues, then who knows? Maybe we shift over to the right side of the screen at some point. So I think that wraps it up, and I'll look forward to hearing your questions or comments. And I'll take the slides down, but put my email up here. I tweet about climate policy, and you can follow me at Noah QK. Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, I'm putting my video back on and audio. I'm going to moderate a series of questions that have been posed in the chat. Let's start with one from Paul Watson. Do you foresee a national interconnection commissioning standard in the U.S. policy roadmap? It seems without that many REP goals would have tremendous delays without the additional physical and digital infrastructure challenge.
Yeah, I mean, did I understand correctly that that's like a electricity transmission expansion? That's what the question's getting at?
I think that's probably right.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard, right? Like this is something we've known we've needed a build out of transmission for a long time, and have had a heck of a difficult time getting any long distance transmission lines built. And part of the problem is the way our laws are set up, which is essentially to give states, and in some cases localities, veto power over transmission that goes through their area. So the more, especially solar and wind that we use, which is sometimes really geographically concentrated, right? We want to use all the wind in West Texas and transmit it to population centers, which maybe in Texas is easier because you don't have to cross state lines, but similar things you see all over the country. It's been really hard to do. And I think that absolutely will be a priority of a Biden administration, is to try to facilitate that. And then hopefully, that sort of wanting to do that combined with sort of a better understanding that this is necessary for climate action starts to shake some things loose. But it's hard. I mean, up in New York, there's sort of the most obvious thing in the world is the need to bring sort of clean hydropower down from Canada, from Quebec. And Quebec wants to do it, and New York State wants to do it, and New York City wants to do it, and they're still having a hard time getting this line across the finish line. So it's a long-winded way of saying that, I think it's absolutely necessary to sort of facilitate that process more, but I don't know exactly how it's going to be done.
Terrific. I'm going to pose a couple of questions from John Olson in the chat. He says, we've invested billions in natural gas supply, and it is the most significant factor in reducing coal and reducing US carbon emissions over the past decade. He thinks it's hard to imagine the best route going forward is just to throw that away and expect success, and suggests that the definition of success needs to include reliable energy supply, not just emissions reduction. And then weighed back in a little bit later, and he thought that the GHG emissions pathway without climate legislation gives too much credit to government interventions for those reductions. And he again praises fuel switching from coal to natural gas that had the US on track to meet Paris. So your thoughts, reactions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated topic, but I think looking backwards, he's absolutely right that natural gas has been as big a part of the story as anything in terms of the emissions reductions we've seen over the last 10, 15 years in the country. Going forward, easy for me to say, but as an economist, I prefer the approach that says we want to reduce emissions, let the best technologies win. And, if we can figure out a way to continue to, there's still more switching from coal to gas in the near term. In the longer term, you can't get to net zero while you're using a significant amount of natural gas. But if carbon capture technologies, start really becoming cost effective, we can use them. We can use the gas infrastructure for some renewable gas and potentially even some hydrogen to some degree. So I would say we should push forward with lots of different opportunities. But, at the same time, I think there's the reality that these sort of unabated continued build out of natural gas just isn't consistent with a sort of net zero future. And we didn't even get into sort of the methane issue, which I think is also important.
I was going to ask about the future of natural gas, but I think you've kind of hinted at that, both in terms of, without ability to sequester carbon, if that technology doesn't come online, it may be more limited in its future, especially if there's continued resistance to address, say, methane emissions. So maybe in that vein, there's a question from Matthew Weldon about, is Texas shooting itself in the foot by not embracing a carbon price as a state rich in higher quality fossil products with more energy per unit of carbon, natural gas and light crude oil? It seems insane for Texas to forfeit premium pricing by allowing coal and heavy crudes to be produced as if they're not more damaging environmentally, a situation that would change with emission pricing. Your thoughts on that? And then I'm going to post some other ones for me that are coming in over the Q&A in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what your policy goal is, right? So like if you're looking to reduce emissions at a low cost, then I fully agree that it is pretty insane not to think about putting a price on emissions as a starting point. I think the issue is in a lot of places, especially carbon intensive places, that's not necessarily the goal, right? So I think part of the reason for that might be sort of just not fully being on board with sort of the idea that we need to be moving to a net zero economy in a few decades. But part of it from a state perspective is like, some states just might not see it as something they can do alone, right? So to some extent, if you have state action, you could see businesses fleeing the state and emissions being produced outside the state. That's why I think from a climate policy perspective, where you have this global pollutant, you really want to see action at sort of a as broad of a scale as possible, which is why you really want the federal government for something like a carbon price.
So that raises a question that was posed in the chat, and I have one about disclosure rules that I want to get to in a second. But what you talked a little bit about, and comes from Joseph Stemler, about the risks of carbon leakage and outsourcing in response to implementation of carbon pricing, and you sort of answered that by saying you want pricing is at the national level, but which may get at problems of leakage, at least within the United States. But there's also the concern that if the US adopts a policy and others don't, that maybe needs to consider border tax adjustments, which has often been perceived as anathema to the international trade regime, which itself is kind of moribund and on its last legs at the moment. And so it's not clear to me that something that's not WTO compatible is much of a constraint anymore. So I'm wondering, to Joseph's question, what are your thoughts on carbon leakage and similar outsourcing in response to the implementation of carbon pricing and other rigorous emissions reduction measures in the US, and how would this impact the efficacy of these measures? And maybe speak to my concern about, is there a easy way to implement border tax adjustments that, wouldn't be administratively burdensome, but also be defensible?
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. I will say the whole concept there that we need to protect our industries is sort of reliant on the idea that the United States is going sort of further beyond its trade partners. So I want to recognize before I answer this that there's a bit of an absurdity to that, because I'd say if anything we're very far behind a lot of our trading partners right now. But I do think there's a legitimate concern that if we were to start down some of these pathways that I mentioned earlier, and China or other countries were on a less aggressive pathway, what would that mean for particularly industries that trade very energy intensive goods internationally? And there's a few ways to think about doing that. So the border adjustment is probably the most elegant way to think about doing that. What you do is you basically tax imports the same way that you tax domestic goods. And you may provide a rebate for exports as well, just to make sure they remain on a level playing field. Josh, to your question about is there an easy way to do that? I don't think so. I think it would be really hard and complicated. You've had decades of scholarship on this issue, and a lot of smart people think it's doable, even though it's challenging. But there's other ways to do it also. Instead of taxing the imports, you could think about compensating those sort of targeted domestic industries and putting them on the level playing field that way. So if you gave them a subsidy to their production, you could retain the incentive they have to reduce their emissions while sort of trying to keep them on a level playing field with their competition that's not subject to the same regulation. So yeah, hope I answered that question.
So we have a question from Karen Kendrick Hans about the nature of disclosure rules for corporations that you have in mind, how they work, what agencies would implement them, and maybe what significance you think they might have for investment patterns thereafter.
I'm going to be honest, I'm not the right person to answer that question. I mean, I think it's a topic that gets a lot of study, and actually the new nominated Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, just produced a report, in combination with a bunch of people talking about, different sort of disclosure activities that could be taken. I personally kind of see it as like it's a really nice thing to have. You want the private sector attuned to the risks that climate is presenting, both in terms of physical risk and transition risk. So the extent that sort of we can change SEC disclosure rules and all those sort of things so that we're sure they're keeping them in mind, I think that's great. But I do think ultimately this is sort of a changing investment patterns for a collective action problem like climate comes down to policy.
I got a couple of questions related to carbon capture and sequestration policy. One from Ramon Trevino, who asked, would the Biden administration augment the 45Q tax credit, which has kickstarted CCUS interest from industrial carbon dioxide sources along the Gulf Coast. And you alluded a little bit earlier about whether costs might come down, but are there, what's your sense of the economics of direct air capture?
Yeah, so that 45Q tax credit, which is like up to $50 a ton for sequestration of carbon dioxide, that is the type of thing I could absolutely see getting done. An extension, I think right now it goes for another 4 or 5 years, and an extension would be very important because these projects take a long time. So wouldn't surprise me at all to see that, because you do see some bipartisan support for carbon capture. In terms of the costs of direct air capture, it's tough. I mean, it's not at all cost effective right now. I mean, it might be $500 a ton at sort of the the initial demonstration type projects that we've seen. And I'm not a technology expert, but I see these reports that suggest that people think the costs could come down to $150, $250 a ton in the next 5 or 10 years. And once you're in that level, it gets really interesting, because you wouldn't want to spend that money if we didn't have climate policy. But if you're saying we legitimately want to get to net zero emissions, that could be quite a bit cheaper than, for example, figuring out a new way to fly planes, which right now we for transatlantic flights, we don't have a good way to do that.
So I'm not sure if my disembodied voice is helpful or hurtful, so I put on my video for the last few questions here. I have some questions related to FERC. Again, Matthew Weldon saying FERC had a fantastic technical session recently on carbon pricing. Commentary was positive on FERC's authority to act and its need to act. He suggests it's amazing, but then Trump removed Commissioner Chatterjee from the chairmanship for entertaining that idea. Could you talk a little bit about what effect you think FERC carbon pricing might have? And there's at least another comment about something very specific on FERC Order 2222. And maybe for those of you who aren't familiar, maybe to the extent you know about that, if you could speak to that as well.
I am going to be a little bit careful, because while I have colleagues who can speak very intelligently to the authorities of FERC, I don't trust myself to. So I'm going to answer those more generally, which is to say, on carbon pricing and more broadly, I think the role of FERC that I expect is to be more of a facilitator of the actions of states and RTOs and ISOs that want to move forward with carbon pricing and other clean energy policies, and just more broadly to find ways to facilitate deployment of solar and wind and all sorts of demand changes on the demand side, where we can have more flexible demand response programs as well. And I think there's important roles for FERC to play there. I wouldn't expect a proactive role where FERC is, acting as sort of, forcing states and regions to move into that direction. From what most of the FERC experts tell me is that they even sort of the climate forward commissioners tend to see their role more as to sort of facilitate markets than to be the environmental regulator.
I got a couple of questions here that are separate, but I think I want to bundle them to make sure we cover as many of them as possible. We've got a question from Gian Claudia Ciara. She asked, absent congressional cooperation to pass the more impactful policies you outlined, how do you see the role of state governments? What are the most meaningful actions state legislators could take, perhaps especially with regard to transportation? So that's one question. And then we have a question from Ting Chang. Concrete and steel production use byproducts from the coal industry. Are there any government policy stimulus to help transition industries like these to coexist with the shift to renewables? So let's take those in turn.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the comment about state action is right. Absent federal action, it's where a lot of the policy change will be. California is probably the best example of a place that has put into place a pretty comprehensive strategy of its own. It has a cap and trade program, a low carbon fuel standard, a whole bunch of other regulations to encourage the deployment of renewables, not only within the state, but it's helping to sort of fund low carbon technologies all over the world because of the way its regulations are set up. New York in recent years is sort of rivaling California in terms of its own policy action. And I think, increasingly I think Arizona had sort of fairly aggressive clean electricity target that was put into place pretty recently. So I do think you're going to see action at the state level. My concern is that in terms of like comprehensive, aggressive action, I think you're going to see it from states like California and New York, but maybe not from Texas and other states like that. With maybe the exception of, again, the power sector, where you do see a lot of this change happening anyway, and it's a lot easier for states to put their foot forward there. And then so in terms of, I think it was steel and cement you mentioned. So that's where, so I mentioned procurement before as a tool the federal government can use. I guess government at all levels, they buy a lot of this stuff. And I think having these sort of buy clean type rules in place could help a lot in terms of decarbonizing steel and cement and other sort of heavy industries. I think there's a limit to how much they can do without sort of a more comprehensive policy that affects the private sector. But it could at least sort of get the process moving. And that's where you might be able to see foreign policy come into play also, where the Biden administration working with other countries to maybe on sort of from a narrow sectoral basis, trying to push forward solutions.
Let me pose one final question, because we're a little bit over time, but we're sort of loose on our, it's not a hard stop for 6:15, but we're just a little bit over time. And I got a question that's sort of provocative that I think speaks to the challenge of why US emissions reductions are important. This again from John Olson. The main emissions by a long shot are China, 27% of the global total. Now the US is around 15%. 14, 15, and in the future, he says also be India, I think is around 7% now, but likely to increase considerably with its economic development. He's asked, are we fooling ourselves by thinking actions in the US and Europe are significant? So maybe you could speak to why US actions are significant, significant for foreign policy, and maybe to what extent the US can play a helpful role not only in reducing its own emissions, but also what role we could play internationally.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to have a very, maybe dangerously US or perception of the US importance in this regard. I mean, I guess the analogy I would use is, think of a quarterback on a football team, right? And the quarterback is like one of 50 players on the football team, but the quarterback has to play well for the football team to have a chance to succeed. And I think leading countries have that kind of role where they just have disproportionate importance, and you're probably not going to see success, getting rid of the analogy, on climate if the United States isn't leading the way, both by setting its example at home and working sort of to leverage its power internationally, which doesn't mean to diminish the challenge with action in places like China and India, but frankly, those leaders there have been taking this problem fairly seriously. They need to, just to reiterate the importance of China saying we're going to get to net zero by 2060, I don't think can be overstated. For decades, they were saying, we're not going to do anything until the developed world leads. And now they're singing a very different tune.
That's terrific. Well, on behalf of University of Texas, I want to thank you all for your participation, and I hope you thank Dr. Kaufman for briefing us today, and we hope that you'll join us for subsequent events, and we hope Dr. Kaufman will come down and enjoy Austin's weather and breakfast tacos again when this pandemic's over and we can do this all in person.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation. Big fan of your work and the Energy Institute as a whole. So hope to take you up on that in the future.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Be safe this Thanksgiving season, and we'll see you next week.